Chapter 22, Section 4. Government actions make a bad situation worse. By early 1931, the economy was a shambles. Stock prices had plunged, bank closings were widespread, manufacturers could not sell their products, and farmers were entering their second decade of financial distress. The federal government, under the leadership of President Herbert Hoover, took steps to improve the situation. Unfortunately, instead of minimizing the damage, many of the government's actions made things worse. A tight money supply hobbles the economy. Many economists blame the Federal Reserve System, known as the Fed, for further weakening the economy in 1930 and 1931. The Fed manages the nation's money supply. It decides how much money will be available to circulate among investors, producers, and consumers. One way it adjusts the money supply is by setting the discount rate. This is the rate of interest at which banks that belong to the system can borrow money from the Federal Reserve banks. Member banks use the discount rate to determine the interest rates they will charge borrowers. Before the stock market crashed, the Fed had kept interest rates low. Low interest rates made borrowing easier. Easy borrowing kept money circulating. In fact, low interest rates had supported the excessive borrowing of the 1920s. Following the crash, Federal Reserve officials kept rates low for a time. Then, in 1931, it began raising the discount rate. The immediate effect of this action was to decrease the amount of money moving through the economy. The timing of this action could not have been worse. Many people had already stopped spending, and producers had slowed production. Higher interest rates further damaged the economy by depriving businesses of the capital they needed to survive. As the amount of money dwindled, the economy slowed down, like an animal going into hibernation. If Federal Reserve officials had concentrated on expanding the money supply after the crash, things might have gotten better. More money in circulation would have stimulated the economy to grow by making loans less expensive. Companies would have found it easier to borrow the money they needed to stay in business. This would have reduced their need to lay off so many workers. Consumers would have had more money in their pockets to spend. This would have kept factories humming. Instead, the Fed allowed the money supply to drop by a third between 1929 and 1933. This decline helped turn a nasty recession into an economic calamity. Tariffs caused trade troubles. Economists also blame Congress for making decisions that further hurt the economy. To understand why, one needs to look beyond the United States. Financial problems overseas, especially in Europe, also contributed to the onset of the Great Depression. World War I had left much of Europe in economic shambles. The Allies were having trouble paying back money borrowed from U.S. banks to finance the war. Germany was in even worse shape. The Germans were able to make their reparation payments to the Allies only by borrowing the money needed from the United States. In order to earn the dollars required to pay off these debts, these nations desperately needed to sell large amounts of goods in the United States. After the war, however, Congress enacted tariffs on many imported goods that made such sales difficult. In 1930, Congress made a bad situation worse by passing the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. Congress meant for this law to protect American businesses from foreign competition by raising tariffs still higher. Instead, it triggered a trade war as European countries raised their tariffs on goods imported from the United States. As a result, U.S. farmers and businesses were not able to cope with overproduction by selling their excess goods to other countries. The record-high tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic stifled international trade. This, in turn, caused a slump in the world economy. Gradually, the Great Depression spread around the globe.